when Hillary Clinton told Ibrahim Traoré, "You will pay dearly for this mistake." She thought she had all her power behind her, until Traoré opened the file and revealed 30 years of Clinton family secrets in Africa. The secure phone line between Washington, D.C. and Ouagadougou crackled with tension as Hillary Clinton's voice cut through the international connection like a blade. It was 3:17 a.m. in Burkina Faso, but Ibrahim Traoré had been expecting this call for weeks. What he hadn't expected was the raw fury in the voice of one of America's most powerful political figures. "President Traoré," Clinton began, her tone carrying the icy authority of someone accustomed to having world leaders defer to her judgment. "I'm calling to discuss your recent decisions regarding American mining interests in your country, decisions that my colleagues and I find deeply concerning." Traoré sat in his private study, surrounded by files that had been delivered to him just hours earlier by a defecting CIA operative. The documents painted a picture of American involvement in African affairs that went far beyond anything he had previously imagined, and at the center of it all was the Clinton family's systematic exploitation of African resources dating back 3 decades. "Secretary Clinton," Traoré replied calmly, "I appreciate your concern for Burkina Faso's welfare. However, our decisions regarding mineral rights are made in the best interests of our people, not foreign corporations." Clinton's laugh was cold and humorless. "President Traoré, I don't think you fully understand the implications of what you're doing. The investments you're blocking represent billions of dollars in American capital. More importantly, they represent relationships that have been carefully cultivated over many years." What Clinton was referring to was Traoré's recent decision to revoke mining concessions that had been granted to American companies under previous Burkina Faso administrations. His investigation had revealed that these concessions had been secured through a combination of bribes, threats, and manipulation that had cost Burkina Faso hundreds of millions in lost revenue, while enriching a network of American politicians and business leaders. "Secretary Clinton, those relationships were built on corruption and exploitation. We have evidence that American officials, including members of your own family, personally profited from agreements that robbed the Burkina Faso people of their rightful share of mineral wealth." The silence on the line stretched for several seconds before Clinton's voice returned, now carrying an unmistakable edge of menace. "President Traoré, you're making a very serious mistake. You're a young leader of a small country that depends on international goodwill and cooperation. I would hate to see that goodwill evaporate due to rash decisions and unfounded accusations." The threat was diplomatically phrased but unmistakable. Clinton was reminding Traoré that Burkina Faso's economy relied heavily on international aid, trade relationships, and diplomatic support that could be withdrawn if he continued to challenge American interests. But Traoré had been preparing for this moment since taking power. He opened the first file on his desk, a thick folder marked Clinton Foundation Africa Operations 1995 to 2020. "Secretary Clinton, before we continue this conversation, I think you should know that we have extensive documentation of your family's activities in Africa. Perhaps you could explain why the Clinton Foundation received $47 million in donations from companies that subsequently received exclusive mining rights in 6 African countries?" Clinton's sharp intake of breath was audible across the international connection. The Clinton Foundation's African operations had been carefully structured to appear philanthropic while serving as a conduit for what amounted to legalized bribery. Companies would make substantial donations to the foundation, which would then advocate for those companies to receive favorable treatment from African government. The Clintons maintained plausible deniability by never directly soliciting the donation, but the quid pro quo arrangements were clear to all parties involved. "That's a very serious accusation," Clinton said, her voice now tight with controlled anger. "The Clinton Foundation's work in Africa has saved countless lives through our health and education initiative. I'm sure some good work was done," Traoré replied evenly. "But according to these documents, less than 12% of Clinton Foundation funds designated for African development actually reached African communities. The rest was used for administrative costs, consulting fees to Clinton family associates, and payments to facilitate mining concessions." He opened a second file. "For example, in 2010, your foundation received a $22 million donation from Barrick Gold Corporation. 3 months later, you personally intervened as Secretary of State to pressure the government of Mali to approve Barrick's acquisition of a gold mine that had been disputed for years. That mine has since generated over $3 billion in revenue, of which Mali received less than 8%. Clinton's response was immediate and fierce. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, President Traoré. The relationships between the United States and African nations are complex arrangements that serve multiple purposes. Your simplistic understanding of international development could damage partnerships that have taken decades to build. Partnership? Traoré repeated. Is that what you call arrangements where African countries provide raw materials at below-market prices while American companies and politicians become wealthy? Where African leaders who resist these arrangements face sudden coups or mysterious accidents? The accusation hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Traoré was venturing into territory that American officials considered absolutely forbidden for discussion. That's a very dangerous line of thinking, Clinton said, her voice now carrying unmistakable menace. Leaders who promote such conspiracy theories often find themselves isolated internationally. They discover that their countries face unexpected economic difficulty, that international development funding becomes unavailable, that their personal safety cannot be guaranteed. It was as direct a threat as Clinton could make without explicitly threatening assassination. But Traoré had been expecting this escalation. Secretary Clinton, are you threatening the elected president of a sovereign nation? I'm explaining reality that you seem not to understand. Your actions have consequences, President Traoré. You will pay dearly for this mistake if you continue down this path. Traoré opened the third and most damaging file on his desk. Secretary Clinton, before you continue making threats, you should know that we have a recording of a phone conversation between you and President Compaoré of Burkina Faso in 2014, a conversation in which you explicitly instructed him to suppress evidence of American involvement in the assassination of Thomas Sankara. The silence on the line was deafening. Traoré could almost hear Clinton's mind racing as she processed the implications of what he had just revealed. The assassination of Thomas Sankara in 1987 had officially been attributed to internal political conflict, but investigators had long suspected international involvement. What Clinton didn't know was that Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's successor, had secretly recorded many of his conversations with foreign officials as insurance against potential betrayal. That's impossible, Clinton stammered, her composure finally cracking. Those conversations were secure. President Compaoré was more paranoid than you realize, Traoré continued. He recorded hundreds of hours of conversations with American, French, and other foreign officials. We now have access to his complete archive. Traoré could hear papers rustling frantically on Clinton's end of the line. What exactly do you think you have? I have your voice, Secretary Clinton, instructing an African president to destroy evidence that would implicate American intelligence services in the murder of one of Africa's most beloved leaders. I have you promising continued American support in exchange for Compaoré's silence. I have you discussing how to manage media coverage to prevent any investigation into American involvement. The phone call had moved far beyond diplomatic pressure into potential criminal exposure. Clinton was realizing that her decades of careful maneuvering in African politics were about to be explosively revealed. President Traoré, Clinton said, her voice now barely controlled. You don't understand the full context of those conversations. International relations require difficult decisions that can't be judged by simplistic moral standards. I understand perfectly, Traoré replied. I understand that American officials orchestrated the assassination of an African leader who threatened American corporate interests. I understand that you personally helped cover up that crime, and I understand that this pattern has been repeated across Africa for decades. He opened a fourth file. Should I tell you about the conversations we have regarding the Democratic Republic of Congo? About how you coordinated with mining companies to destabilize regions where local leaders demanded fair compensation for mineral extraction. Clinton's breathing had become audibly ragged. What do you want? The question marked a complete surrender of her initial position of strength. She was no longer making threats. She was negotiating to limit damage to herself and her family. I want you to stop calling African leaders to threaten them when they make decisions that serve their people rather than American corporations. Traoré said simply, I want the United States to accept that Africa is no longer available for exploitation through bribery and intimidation. And if I agree to adjust our approach to African relationships, then these recordings and documents remain confidential. But if American officials continue threatening African leaders, or if any harm comes to me or my administration, everything will be released simultaneously to WikiLeaks, Al Jazeera, and the International Criminal Court. Clinton was silent for a long moment, processing the impossible position she found herself in. An African leader she had intended to intimidate had turned the tables completely, exposing her to potential criminal prosecution while demanding fundamental changes in American foreign policy. This is blackmail, she said finally. This is justice, Traoré corrected. For the first time in decades, an African leader has enough evidence to hold American officials accountable for their crimes against our continent. You have a choice. Accept that Africa will no longer be exploited, or face the consequences of your actions. The phone call continued for another 20 minutes, with Clinton alternately pleading, threatening, and attempting to negotiate. But Traoré's position was unshakable. He had evidence that could destroy not just Clinton's remaining political ambitions, but potentially land her in international criminal court. When the call finally ended, Clinton was left staring at her phone in her Washington, D.C. home, realizing that her decades of African manipulation had finally been exposed by someone with the courage and evidence to fight back. Within hours, word of the conversation had spread through Washington's intelligence community. The CIA operative who had provided the evidence to Traoré was already in protective custody, having anticipated Clinton's likely response to the exposure of her crime. For Clinton, the conversation marked the effective end of her influence in African affairs. Within weeks, American mining companies were quietly withdrawing problematic contracts across the continent as word spread about the evidence in Traoré's possession. The documents Traoré had referenced were eventually compiled into a comprehensive report that was shared with the African Union, detailing 3 decades of American interference in African governance. The report became the foundation for a new African policy of resistance to neo-colonial manipulation. Clinton herself retreated from public appearances and international affairs, her staff citing health concerns. But those close to her knew that she was struggling to process the complete reversal of a power dynamic she had taken for granted for decades. 6 months later, at an African Union summit, Traoré addressed continental leaders about the conversation that had changed everything. For too long, we have accepted that African leaders who challenge Western exploitation will face threat, isolation, and worse, he told the assembled presidents and ministers. But when we have evidence of their crime, when we stand together, when we refuse to be intimidated, they discover that their power has limits. The speech received a standing ovation and led to the establishment of a continental intelligence sharing network designed to protect African leaders from foreign interference. Clinton, who had begun the conversation expecting to intimidate a small country's president into submission, had instead triggered a transformation in African-American relations that would reshape international politics for years to come. The irony was not lost on political observers. In attempting to silence an African leader, Clinton had instead silenced herself, her decades of African crimes finally exposed by someone with the courage to fight back. Years later, when asked about the conversation that had changed everything, Traoré would reflect, "Power without accountability is just organized crime." Secretary Clinton learned that even the most powerful criminals can be held responsible when their victims refuse to stay silent. The phone call that was meant to end Traoré's resistance instead became the beginning of Africa's liberation from decades of American manipulation and exploitation. Clinton's threats had backfired spectacularly, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to intimidation is simply telling the truth. But the story was far from over. In the months following Clinton's humiliating defeat, the ripple effects of that conversation would reshape global politics in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The first major consequence came just 2 weeks after the phone call, when 3 more African leaders publicly disclosed that they had received similar threatening calls from American officials. The president of Ghana revealed that a former U.S. ambassador had explicitly warned him that accidents happen to leaders who don't understand their place in the global order. Nigeria's president shared recordings of conversations where State Department officials had demanded that he reverse policies favoring Nigerian ownership of oil resources. These revelations triggered what international media began calling the African Disclosure Movement. Leaders across the continent began releasing documentation of American interference in their internal affairs. The evidence was overwhelming and systematic. Decades of threats, bribes, and manipulation designed to maintain American corporate access to African resources at below-market prices. The response from Washington was predictably aggressive. The State Department issued statements claiming that the recordings were fabricated by hostile foreign powers seeking to damage American-African relationships. American media outlets, many of which had financial ties to the same corporations implicated in the document, largely ignored or dismissed the revelation. But the damage to American credibility was irreversible. When the president of Kenya released phone records showing that American officials had threatened to withdraw HIV/AIDS funding unless he approved a mining concession, even American allies began questioning the moral foundation of U.S. foreign policy. Clinton herself became increasingly isolated within Democratic Party circles. Her signature issue, advancing women's rights globally, was undermined by evidence that she had personally threatened female African leaders who challenged American corporate interests. The feminist foreign policy she had championed was revealed as selective activism that stopped where American economic interests began. The psychological impact on Clinton was devastating. Associates described her as increasingly paranoid and reclusive, obsessed with controlling the narrative around her African activities. She hired private intelligence firms to investigate the sources of the leaked document and spent enormous sums attempting to discredit the evidence against her. Meanwhile, Traoré was becoming an international symbol of resistance to neo-colonial exploitation. His speeches at the United Nations and African Union gatherings drew standing ovations from delegates who had never before heard an African leader speak so directly about Western manipulation. When he addressed the General Assembly about the courage to say no to powerful criminals, the applause lasted for nearly 5 minutes. The economic consequences for American corporations were severe. Stock prices for major mining companies with African operations plummeted as investors realized that the era of guaranteed access to cheap African resources was ending. Barrick Gold, specifically named in Clinton's leaked conversation, lost 40% of its market value within 6 months as African governments began renegotiating or canceling existing contracts. European powers, sensing an opportunity to distance themselves from American practices, began offering alternative partnerships to African nations. France, ironically, positioned itself as a more respectful partner despite its own history of African exploitation. The competition for African resources intensified, but now African leaders had evidence-based negotiating power they had never possessed before. The most significant long-term impact was the transformation of African unity from a theoretical concept to a practical alliance. The shared experience of American threats created genuine solidarity among leaders who had previously competed for Western favor. They began coordinating policies, sharing intelligence, and presenting unified positions in international negotiations. Traoré established what became known as the Ouagadougou Protocol, a series of agreements between African nations for mutual defense against foreign interference. If any signatory nation faced economic or political pressure for asserting sovereignty over its resources, all other signatories would provide alternative trade relationships and diplomatic support. The protocols effectively ended the Western ability to isolate individual African countries for challenging exploitative arrangements. Clinton's attempts at damage control became increasingly desperate. She arranged secret meetings with African diplomats, offering development aid and debt forgiveness in exchange for statements questioning the authenticity of the leaked recording. But her approaches were consistently rebuffed and often publicized, further damaging her credibility. The former Secretary of State's health declined noticeably during this period. The stress of potential criminal exposure, combined with the collapse of her carefully constructed legacy, took a visible toll. She canceled planned speaking engagements and withdrew from public appearances, citing ongoing medical issues. The legal implications of the evidence Traoré possessed extended far beyond political embarrassment. International law experts began discussing the possibility of charges at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity related to the systematic exploitation of African resources. While such charges would face political obstacles, the mere possibility represented a shocking reversal for someone who had spent decades confident of her immunity from consequences. 1 year after the conversation that changed everything, Traoré was invited to address the World Economic Forum in Davos, a venue where African leaders had traditionally been marginalized participants rather than featured speakers. His speech, titled "The End of Economic Colonialism," was watched by millions worldwide and marked a definitive shift in how global power dynamics were understood. "The conversation I had with Secretary Clinton represents more than one phone call," Traoré told the assembled global elite. "It represents the moment when Africa stopped accepting that our poverty was natural and started recognizing it as manufactured. We have the resources, we have the people, and now we have the courage to demand our rightful place as equals in the global economy." The applause from the audience was notably restrained, reflecting the discomfort of Western business leaders who understood that their era of unquestioned African access was ending. But the message was clear: Africa would no longer be a silent partner in its own exploitation. For Hillary Clinton, watching the speech from her home in New York, the irony was bitter. Her attempt to silence one African leader had amplified the voices of an entire continent. Her threat to make Traoré pay dearly had instead made her pay the ultimate political price: irrelevance. The Clinton Foundation, once a powerful vehicle for international influence, quietly wound down its African operations. Corporate donors who had previously seen the foundation as a pathway to African markets withdrew their support, understanding that the model of influence peddling that Clinton had perfected was no longer viable. Clinton's political career, which had survived numerous scandals and setbacks over 3 decades could not survive the revelation that she had personally orchestrated the exploitation of the world's poorest continent. The feminist icon had been exposed as someone who threatened other women for challenging American corporate interests. The champion of international development had been revealed as an architect of systematic underdevelopment. As the second anniversary of their confrontation approached, Traoré reflected on how a single phone call had transformed not just his presidency, but the entire relationship between Africa and the West. Secretary Clinton called to threaten me, but she ended up liberating a continent, he told a gathering of African youth leaders. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be afraid. When we stopped fearing their threats and started exposing their crimes, everything changed. The phone call that Hillary Clinton had initiated as an exercise in American power had become the catalyst for American decline in Africa. Her threats had not silenced Traoré. They had given him and an entire continent the evidence they needed to break free from decades of systematic exploitation. In the end, Clinton's attempt to make Traoré pay for his defiance had cost her everything she had spent a lifetime building. Her legacy, once that of a global stateswoman and champion of the oppressed, was permanently rewritten as that of a neo-colonial enforcer whose arrogance had triggered her own downfall. The silence that Clinton had tried to impose on Africa had instead become her own eternal silence, her voice no longer welcome in the international forum where she had once commanded respect. The continent she had tried to control had instead controlled her fate, proving that sometimes justice comes not from the powerful, but from the courage of those who refuse to be powerless.